Jason Carter, an accomplished black entrepreneur, had just wrapped up another round of meetings with investors. The long flight had left him exhausted, but he needed a peaceful, luxurious place to recharge for the next day's business negotiations. The Grand Regent Hotel was one of the finest in the city, its towering glass exterior and lavish interior promising the comfort and serenity he sought. As the car pulled up to the grand entrance, Jason marveled at the opulence of the place. The marble floors, the sparkling chandeliers, the exquisite artwork adorning the walls, it all spoke of wealth, exclusivity, and an impeccable reputation. Jason's status as a successful businessman had afforded him the luxury of staying at places like this, but something about this trip made him uneasy. Maybe it was the nagging feeling that, despite his success, he was still seen as an outsider in the world of high society. The doorman greeted him with a warm smile as he stepped out of the car. Jason nodded politely, not thinking much of it. He knew he had a long way to go before he felt truly comfortable in environments like this. Upon entering the hotel lobby, Jason was immediately struck by its grandeur. The ceilings stretched high above, adorned with golden accents and large, magnificent paintings. The check-in counter was polished to perfection, and behind it stood a woman with pale blonde hair, her features cold but professional. "Good evening," she said, barely glancing up from her computer screen. "How may I assist you?" Jason smiled and approached the desk. "I have a reservation. Jason Carter." The woman's fingers froze over the keyboard for a moment, and she finally looked up, her eyes scanning him with a faint hint of confusion. "Carter?" she repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Are you sure that's the name on the reservation?" Jason nodded, his smile faltering slightly. "Yes, I'm sure." The woman tapped the keys again, her eyes flicking back to the screen. "Ah, yes, Mr. Carter, your reservation is here." She handed him a key card with a forced smile. "Enjoy your stay." Jason nodded, about to turn away, but something about her tone and the dismissive way she had addressed him bothered him. There had been no warmth in her greeting, no professionalism, just cold efficiency. It felt as though she had been expecting a different kind of guest, someone more in line with the image of the hotel's elite clientele. As he made his way to the elevator, Jason couldn't shake the uncomfortable feeling gnawing at him. He had experienced discrimination before, but he had hoped that places like this, with their polished exteriors and reputations for luxury, would be different. Clearly, he was wrong. The elevator ride was uneventful, but the second Jason stepped into the hallway of the 15th floor, the unease settled in even deeper. He looked at the key card in his hand and entered his suite. The spacious room was stunning, an entire wall of windows overlooking the city, with a king-sized bed draped in high thread-count sheets. Despite the luxury surrounding him, he couldn't shake the feeling of being an outsider. He walked around the room, unpacking his things, but his mind kept returning to the encounter with the receptionist. The suspicion lingered. Had she treated him that way because of his appearance? Did she assume he didn't belong here? Jason stood by the window, watching the city's lights flicker below. His phone buzzed on the bedside table, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a message from his assistant, confirming the details of tomorrow's meeting. Jason sighed. He needed to rest. He couldn't afford to dwell on these feelings right now, but the seeds of doubt had been planted, and no amount of luxury could erase them. Later that evening, as Jason dined alone in the hotel's upscale restaurant, he caught a glimpse of the receptionist walking past, this time with a colleague. He overheard their conversation, and what he heard made his stomach tighten. "That man from earlier, he's staying in the penthouse suite," the receptionist remarked to her colleague. "You don't think he's really staying here, do you?" The other woman laughed dismissively. "I doubt it. He looks like he's just passing through, probably a tech guy or something, trying to impress people." Jason sat still, his heart sinking. The casual racism in her words stung more than he had anticipated. He had been trying to give her the benefit of the doubt, but now, hearing it out loud, there was no mistaking it. The woman had assumed he didn't belong. The next morning, after a sleepless night, Jason decided to shake off the discomfort and focus on his meetings. But as he entered the elevator to head to the lobby, he encountered the receptionist again. This time, she wasn't so casual in her greeting. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," she said, but her tone was colder than before. Her eyes seemed to linger on him in a way that made him feel self-conscious. Jason forced a polite smile. "Good morning." After his meetings, Jason returned to the hotel, hoping to relax, but when he entered his room, he was taken aback. Some of his personal items, his laptop, a few files, had been moved around. At first, he thought it was his imagination, But as he inspected the room more closely, he realized that things were definitely out of place. Jason's pulse quickened. His first thought was that perhaps the hotel staff had entered his room to clean or check on something, but that didn't explain the personal items being disturbed. The thought gnawed at him, making him feel exposed and vulnerable. Yet, as he sat in his hotel suite that evening, the weight of being constantly watched and underestimated was beginning to feel unbearable. His room felt less like a refuge and more like a cage. Jason stood in front of the large window, looking out at the city skyline, feeling as though the walls were closing in on him. He had been the one who paid for the penthouse suite. He had earned his place here, but none of that mattered to the people who had brushed him off so casually. The next morning, Jason decided to put the incident with the receptionist behind him. He was here for business, not for petty confrontations. But as he opened his suitcase to retrieve his laptop, something caught his eye. His leather briefcase, the one containing sensitive documents, was slightly open. His heart skipped a beat. He hadn't left it open. It took him only a second to confirm what he already feared. Some of his personal files had been disturbed. His laptop, which he had kept locked in the briefcase, was now sitting on the bed, open but closed enough to conceal any activity. Jason had a gut feeling that this was no simple mistake. The hotel staff had been in his room again, without his permission. He quickly checked the rest of his belongings, papers, personal items. All were out of place. His clothes were neatly hung up in the closet, untouched, but it didn't matter. His sense of privacy had been violated. Furious, Jason left the suite and made his way to the front desk. His stride purposeful, he found the receptionist, Karen, sitting at the counter, her fingers tapping away at the keyboard. Her eyes flicked up briefly when he approached, but she didn't seem alarmed. "I'd like to speak with your manager again," Jason said, keeping his tone measured. Karen looked at him for a long moment, an unreadable expression on her face. Then, without a word, she picked up the phone and dialed a number. A moment later, the manager appeared, his demeanor as aloof and dismissive as ever. Jason was growing increasingly frustrated, but he remained calm, knowing that if he lost his cool now, it would only add to the narrative that he was difficult. "I've had a problem with my room," Jason began. "My personal belongings have been tampered with. It's not the first time, and I'm afraid it's no longer something I'm willing to overlook." The manager gave him a small, insincere smile. "I'm terribly sorry, Mr. Carter, but I assure you that our staff is highly trained and would never violate a guest's privacy. Perhaps you've simply forgotten." Jason cut him off. "No, I haven't forgotten, and I'm sure it wasn't a mistake. Someone on your staff has been in my room multiple times, and I demand an explanation." The manager shifted uncomfortably. "We'll look into it immediately, but I must ask, are you sure about this? Could it be that?" "No," Jason said firmly. "I know what I'm talking about. I've been in this business long enough to know when something is off, and this is off." The manager didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned toward Karen, giving her a subtle nod. She stood and left the desk without saying a word. Jason, sensing something was off, didn't let his guard down. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Jason went down to the front desk to ask about the situation. He found the receptionist once again. This time, she barely looked up as he approached. "Excuse me," Jason began, keeping his voice steady, "but some of my belongings in my room have been moved. I'd like to know why." The woman glanced at him, then continued typing on her keyboard, seemingly unfazed. "We don't know anything about that, Mr. Carter. Perhaps you misplaced them." Jason's temper flared, but he bit his tongue. "I'm sure I didn't misplace anything," he said, his voice tight. "I expect a full explanation, and I'd like to speak to your manager." Her gaze hardened for a moment, then she nodded curtly. "I'll inform him." Jason waited in the lobby, frustration building with each passing minute. The hotel was supposed to be a place of refuge, of rest. Instead, it had become a battleground for his dignity. When the manager finally arrived, he gave Jason a look of mild annoyance, as though Jason were the one causing the disturbance. "We'll look into the situation, Mr. Carter," the manager said dismissively, offering no real apology. "Please allow us time to resolve it." Jason stood there for a moment, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that his concerns were being brushed aside because of his race. This wasn't just an isolated incident, it was part of something bigger, something deeply ingrained in the culture of the hotel. As Jason left the lobby, he made a decision. He would no longer accept being treated this way. He wasn't just a guest at this hotel, he was a man who had earned his place in the world, and he would make sure that everyone knew it. Jason Carter had spent his entire life proving that he was worthy of every inch of success he had earned. Growing up in a world where doors often closed in his face simply because of the color of his skin, he had learned to push through adversity. Every deal he had secured, every partnership he had built, had been a victory against the forces that sought to keep him down. When Karen returned, it wasn't just her usual icy demeanor that sent a chill through the air, it was the look in her eyes. She glanced at Jason, a flicker of something dark passing between them, and then turned back to the manager, speaking in low tones. The first email went to his lawyer. Jason had been in contact with him for years, but this situation was different. This time, the issue was more than just money. It was about justice. It was about exposing the systemic prejudice that lingered in the most insidious places, in the spaces where people like Jason, despite their wealth or status, still found themselves at the mercy of those who believed they didn't belong. The second email was sent to his journalist friend, Marcus, who had always been quick to see the bigger picture. Jason outlined the events of the last 24 hours, painting a picture of the hotel staff's behavior, and how their treatment of him was just another example of the subtle but powerful racism that ran through the veins of society. As Jason hit send on both emails, a sense of purpose washed over him. He wasn't just a victim in this scenario, he was a catalyst. A change was coming, and he would be the one to lead it. The following morning, Jason woke up to the first wave of responses. His lawyer had already begun working on legal recourse, preparing to file a formal complaint against the hotel for breaching his privacy and violating consumer protection laws. But it was Marcus's email that made Jason pause. The subject line read, "This is bigger than you think." Jason opened the email, and Marcus's words hit him hard. "I've been digging into this, Jason, and what you've experienced at this hotel is just the tip of the iceberg. Your story is tragic, but it's part of a larger narrative that I'm starting to see play out in other businesses and industries. This hotel is just one example of how black customers, no matter their status, are often treated like they don't belong. I think it's time to shine a light on this, not just for you, but for everyone who's ever been made to feel invisible." Jason sat back in his chair, staring at the screen. Marcus was right. What had happened to him was not an isolated incident. It wasn't just about a hotel. It was about a pervasive problem that ran deeper than he had ever realized. But Jason also knew that the only way to fight this was head-on. He couldn't afford to back down now. If he did, he would be just another story that faded into the background, another black man who had been mistreated but never given the platform to speak his truth. He had to push forward, no matter what it took. Jason's patience was wearing thin. "I'd like to speak to the staff member who entered my room," he demanded. "Now." The manager looked uncomfortable but nodded, turning to Karen. A few minutes passed before the staff member in question arrived, a young man named Greg, who had been part of the hotel's maintenance team. "I don't understand," Greg stammered, looking anywhere but at Jason. "We were just checking the locks, sir. I didn't mean to disturb your things." Jason's eyes narrowed. "So, you just went into my room and started going through my belongings? I never authorized anyone to enter." Greg's nervous glance shifted to Karen, who was standing at the back of the lobby, her arms crossed. It was clear she had been involved in this. I'm sorry," Greg muttered. "I didn't know you were the owner, sir. If I had, I would have." The words hung in the air like a threat. Jason knew exactly what he was hearing. If he hadn't been Jason Carter, a black man who didn't belong in their world, he would have been treated with far more respect. Greg's apology wasn't enough. It wasn't even close. Jason stood tall, his voice calm but firm. "I don't care about your apologies, and I don't care about the excuses. This is your hotel's problem, and now you're going to deal with it." He turned on his heel and walked out of the lobby, not waiting for them to respond. He needed space to think, to gather his thoughts before confronting this head-on. Back in his room, Jason locked the door behind him, feeling more isolated than ever. This wasn't just a hotel issue. This was about respect, about how he was seen in a world that constantly undervalued his contributions. But he wasn't going to let them get away with it. He knew he had to make a choice: either continue to let this slide and return to his life, or take action and fight back. The decision was clear. He wasn't about to let this hotel, or anyone else, get away with disrespecting him. As Jason sat at the desk in his suite, staring at his laptop, he started making calls. He reached out to his lawyer, explaining the situation in detail. he also contacted a journalist friend, someone who could help him make sure that the world knew exactly how he had been treated. Within hours, Jason had a strategy. He wasn't just going to settle for a simple apology. He was going to use this moment as a platform for change. This hotel was just a microcosm of a much larger problem, and Jason knew it was time to expose the ugliness that was simmering beneath the surface. He wasn't just a guest at this hotel, he owned it, and now, the hotel staff would have to answer to him. Jason Carter's fingers hovered over the keyboard, his mind racing as he prepared to send the emails that would set his plan into motion. He wasn't just going to let this slide. No, this was more than an affront to his personal space. It was a clear message that people like him, no matter their accomplishments, would never truly be seen as equals in a system that was built to marginalize them. But Jason wasn't going to stand idly by. He was going to take control of this situation, just like he had with every other challenge life had thrown his way. That afternoon, Jason made his way back to the hotel. The manager, who had been apologetic the day before, was visibly on edge as soon as he saw Jason walking through the doors. Jason had called ahead, informing the hotel that he was coming to speak to the entire staff. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he was determined to take control of the narrative. As he entered the conference room where the staff had gathered, the room fell silent. The manager, Karen, Greg, and a few others stood near the front, looking at him with a mixture of uncertainty and apprehension. Jason could feel the weight of their stares. They didn't expect him to be here. They didn't expect him to come back and demand an explanation, let alone a confrontation. But Jason wasn't about to let them off the hook. "Good afternoon," Jason said, his voice steady but firm. "I've come here to address something that's been bothering me for a while now, and I need all of you to listen carefully. I don't want to hear any excuses or apologies. I'm not interested in hearing how this was a misunderstanding. What happened here, yesterday, was not a mistake. It was a calculated decision, a decision that, I'm sure, was influenced by the very biases that you may not even realize exist in this hotel, or in this city." The manager opened his mouth to speak, but Jason held up his hand, silencing him. "You see," Jason continued, "what happened to me was something that's been happening for decades, if not longer. Black people, no matter how successful, no matter how wealthy, are still treated like they're not supposed to be here, like they don't belong in these spaces. And I know exactly what I'm talking about. I've been in these situations before." Jason paused, letting his words sink in. He could feel the tension in the room, but he didn't back down. This wasn't just for him. This was for everyone who had ever been made to feel less than because of the color of their skin. "You violated my privacy, and in doing so, you exposed something much larger than just your poor decision-making. You've shown me that the prejudice that exists within these walls isn't just a flaw in your system, it's part of the fabric that makes up this entire establishment. You've made it clear that no matter how much money I have, no matter how much success I've earned, I'll always be seen as other in your eyes." Jason turned his gaze toward Karen, who had been quiet through most of his speech. She seemed to be shifting uncomfortably, her eyes darting away from his. "I'm not here to tear this hotel down," Jason said, his tone softer now, "but I am here to make it clear that I won't be silenced. I won't let anyone tell me I don't belong, and neither will the people who stand with me." He looked around the room, making sure that everyone heard him. This was the moment where everything would change, whether they liked it or not. The staff had a choice to make. Jason walked out of the conference room, his heart pounding in his chest. It wasn't over yet, but as he left the hotel, he couldn't help but feel that something had shifted. For the first time, he had stood up, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been pushed aside because of their race. The fight wasn't over, but this was a victory. It wasn't the end, but it was a beginning. And Jason Carter was ready for what came next.